Okay, well, good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome to Sunday School here on the 30th of October. And what's that?
Sorry about that. I lost a day someplace.
Oh, you're trying to make it the 28th?
29.
29th. Oh. Well, the rest of us will probably celebrate it as the 30th. Here at Solid Rock Bible Church, Kansas City, Missouri. And if you're joining us online, we welcome you and are glad you're here with us. Now, frankly, I'm not sure exactly where John was in his study through 1 Timothy. I don't know if he's finished 1 Timothy. Had he finished it yet? Well, what I thought we would do is go to chapter 5, because this is a very important chapter, has a lot of information in it, and it's about interpersonal relationships, and so I thought it'd be a good thing for us to study. And let's go ahead and we'll ask the Lord's blessing on the study of His Word. Our Father, we are thankful for your Word and pray that you will bless it to our lives and to our understanding of you, our understanding of how you want us to live. I pray your blessing on every person here and those listening online. And I pray you'll help us all in our walk with you in Jesus' name. Amen. So Paul is writing this epistle, 1 Timothy. He's writing that to Timothy, who was pastor of the church at Ephesus. And so, if you will remember, Ephesus is not primarily a Jewish community. It is primarily a Gentile area. I think that's important, especially for chapter 5 here. Then he also will write another pastoral epistle after this called Titus. And that's to Titus, who was working on the island of Crete, setting up elders and deacons in the churches that had been established by Paul on that island. And then after that, he will write 2 Timothy. Now, if you will remember, just a little bit of a time frame, Paul was released from his first imprisonment in Rome in 62. And most scholars believe that what Paul did at that point was went to the island of Crete and went even as far as Spain, ministering the gospel, so he was ministering probably throughout several of the churches. And so when he writes to Timothy, he has left Timothy as the pastor at Ephesus, and then he had gone on to Crete. He had Titus with him, and he leaves Titus in Crete and then Paul goes on. Well, then he writes back to Titus, establishing him as the leader there, but also having him appoint elders in all the cities that were there. So when we come to chapter 5, this chapter is important because it's about interpersonal relationships. The interpersonal relationships in the church, but particularly what Paul has in mind is, Timothy, this is how you're supposed to pastor. And this is about your interpersonal relationships as a leader in the church. And of course, that would affect not only him, but also all the other church leaders that were there would be listening to this instruction and So that's very important. Well, before we get into that, many years ago, it occurred to me that maturity can be measured in terms of some words that start with R. And I use this a lot in premarital counseling or in marital counseling. You can measure the maturity and readiness for marriage in some respects with these words that start with R. And I mentioned some of them here. And the first one is respect. Treat people like you want to be treated. People are made in the image of God. That gives them great value in the eyes of God. In fact, God has never created anything that He values more than when He created people. How do I know that?
The Bible says so.
Well, think about this. God created the heavens. Are they permanent in His economy? No. There'll be a new heavens and a new earth. He created the planets, this earth that we live on. Is this permanent the way it is? No. God's going to there'll be a new heavens and a new earth. Even animals. We aren't told that animals, not all dogs go to heaven. In fact, none of the dogs go to heaven. And so we don't have any statements about the eternality of animals. What about angels? Well, the Bible doesn't say. We know that there were some fallen angels, but there was no provision for the salvation of fallen angels. People are the only ones that are said to be made in the image of God. Of all of God's creation, we are made in His image. Other things He made are not. So we are made to look like, to reflect in our character, in our personality, to reflect the qualities of the Creator who made us in His image. That's why you can love. You're made in the image of a God who's very loving. And by the way, that's why you can hate. You're made in the image of God who has hatred. You're made in the image of an administrator. God is the great administrator, the great king of the universe. And you have aspirations to put order in your own life. Maybe you have aspirations to put order into your spouse's life. We train our kids in ways that they would order their lives. We, as people, like symmetry. That's a real common trait. You don't find that in so much in animals. All you have to do is get in an airplane and fly, and you'll see things are laid out square. You'll see, if you fly over certain parts of the country, round irrigation places, and you'll see these perfect circles, half a mile in diameter. And you'll see all of these things and when we build a building, we want the building to be square and plumb, unless you deliberately decide, no, I want to make my building crooked so it gets attention of people. But that's out of the norm. You really, normally when we build things, we want them square and straight, we want them plumb, and we make levels to establish those things. Why? Because you're made in the image of a God of order. And so when we respect people, we respect them because they're made in the image of God. we ought to live humbly as servants of each other. That's a form of our respect. We ought to respect people even when they disagree with us or when they treat us with disrespect. We're to treat other people's property with respect. Treat the house of the Lord with respect. That's that word, respect. Let me tell you, a marital relationship that is lacking in respect is not going to last. It's just not going to last. People want to be treated with dignity. God wrote that right in your DNA, that you desire to be treated with dignity. The second R word I use is responsibility. Do what you are called to do and do your very best you can, and finish what you start. You ought to discipline yourself to do a few things very well instead of a lot of things not so good. That's responsibility. And I want to say that a marriage doesn't last very long where both of them are irresponsible. Even one of them is irresponsible, doesn't keep their promises, doesn't do what they ought to do. They don't keep their vows. That's an irresponsible person, and that marriage doesn't last without responsibility. The third one is restraint. Don't say everything that comes to your mind. Some people do. And it gets some people into trouble. Some people have no filter. They just, there it is. Well, I know I shouldn't have said that, you'll hear them say later. But they're really not planning to change. Don't do everything you feel like doing just because it comes to your mind. Have some restraint. Restrain your impulses. Restrain your tongue. And I want to say that in any kind of relationship, if you don't have restraint, and you don't have some controls on that tongue or on your impulses, that relationship's not going to last. I used to just have those three, and when my daughters were young, when Jana was young, this is back in the 80s, we got a call late at night. She lived in Colorado. Dad, I've met the man that I want to marry, and he's respectful, responsible, and restrained. It was all one sentence. I said, I'll be the judge of that. And I was, and he was, and they've been married for 25, I don't know, 30, I'm not sure how many years, a lot of years. I added a couple more here. Reverence. You ought to give God and His Word the rightful respect and place in your life. Again, we're measuring maturity of people, spiritual maturity, and restitution. Boy, here's a big one, kind of one of my pet peeves. If you borrow something, return it as quickly as you can in at least as good a shape or better than when you borrowed it. If you lose it, look very hard to find it. And if you can't find it, replace it with an identical thing or better. If you damage or break something, fix it or replace it. Don't leave it for someone else to fix. Take ownership of your actions. If you owe money, pay it back as quickly as you can. It just makes sense. We could put that under respect, couldn't we, or responsibility. Both of those carry those concepts. And I just would say that if these are lacking in relationships, that relationship is in trouble. that relationship is in trouble. I think you can see that. Anybody want to make a comment on that before we go biblical? All right. So Paul is addressing his comments to Pastor Timothy. We can think of the church as a large family with family dynamics. We have natural categories of people within the church. There are age differences, generational differences. There are gender differences, spiritual growth differences, personality differences, background differences. Paul points out here the importance of advising how age and gender affects how we ought to treat each other. And one of the biggest challenges in ministry for pastors and others in leadership positions is to relate and work with others effectively. Pastors often fail at being able to relate to people in a proper way, and sometimes they're overbearing, controlling, or the opposite, and don't provide leadership. Sometimes they're sometimes people think that having a position gives them authority over people. You remember what Jesus said? The Gentiles lord it over each other, but it shall not be for you. For whoever is great among you must be what? A servant. And the greatest among you will be a servant to all. And so in the church, authority means I have more people to serve. That's what it means. But some pastors get the idea that means I got the final say. I got the authority. You got to do what I say. That is not a biblical concept. It really isn't. The following information is from the Net Bible Notes, Dr. Constable from Dallas Seminary. By the way, if you're doing Bible study on your own, I really suggest a very great free online resource for you. And if you want to just jot that down, it is Lumina, 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 and it's the Net Bible. So I type in Lumina, Net Bible, and that will bring up the notes of the Net Bible. This is the Net Bible right here. And this has all the notes that are free online, 60,000 notes in here. It's very fine print. But you'll find that to be very, very helpful. In the online version, not this version, but the online version, you'll have a choice of some other resources with that, and one of those is notes. And you can have net notes or you can have constable's notes. And so in constable's note, that's Dr. Thomas Constable. He's been at the seminary. He was there when I was there, which was shortly after the flood. In those, you'll find some very interesting information. So I took something from there because I thought this was kind of interesting, and I printed it for you. And so he's got some notes. The Conference on Student Development in Theological Education in June of 1985. There was that conference that was held, and the speaker, Dr. David Schuler of the Association of Theological Schools, made the following comments. He's talking to a group of students who are studying for the ministry. That's what that conference was about. And you made this statement of those ministers that are involuntarily terminated by churches. In other words, the pastor got fired, okay? In recent years, only 6 to 13% failed due to professional incompetence. But 46% were unsatisfactory due to interpersonal incompetence. Of this second group, half of them were too autocratic, they were controllers, and the other half were too passive, and they provided no leadership. And Schuller gave 9 signs of interpersonal incompetence of pastors. They did not understand the situation, especially what they personally had done to make the matter worse. They didn't understand the dynamics of a conflict. That may identify a failure to listen and observe, but that was a problem. Secondly, they blamed others instead of accepting personal responsibility when they did something wrong. They just want to pass the buck. Third, they did not delegate appropriately. Number 4, they were unable to develop common loyalties with people. They couldn't get people to trust them, or trust their leadership. They were unable to make clear and direct statements or to behave consistently with the statements they did make. So they don't practice what they preach. They needed emotional support and approval all the time from everybody. They couldn't stand it if somebody didn't like them. Well, I tell you what, you're going to have a very, very small congregation if you'll only pastor people who like you. Yeah. And number 7, they were unable to interpret the present in terms of reality. They were not on the same wavelength with their congregation. They really could not see reality the way other people see it. I dealt with a fellow for a long time who fit that category, was in the ministry, and he fit that category to a T. They treated differentness as a threat. These were very insecure guys, so somebody who was different, who was different from them, they saw that as a threat. Number 9, they did not support others emotionally while disagreeing intellectually. So again, that looks like you disagree with me, that's a threat, and I'm not going to support you emotionally through that disagreement that you have. I think all of that's important in light of what Paul is going to talk about here.
So why are those type of people even in the ministry?
You know what is interesting is all kinds of people enter the ministry, and sometimes they get weeded out soon, and sometimes they last way too long in ministry. But I've often wondered why some people ever went into the ministry. Well, they never seemed like a fit. You know what? There's a lot of damage that can be done by a person who is in leadership in a church, whether it's the pastor or another person on staff or even on the deacon board. Because church by its very nature is a place that people will come when they are broken. It's one of the places in society you go when you're broken, right? And when you want help and encouragement and help getting through life, you want to go to a place you think is safe for that kind of encouragement. And when that doesn't happen, it can be very devastating. Let's look at chapter. Yeah.
Sometimes are politicians affected with that same disease?
You know a politician who's selfish? Self-seeking? Let's read chapter 5, verses 1 and 2. Somebody read it good and loud for me.
Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters with all purity.
And now remember, Paul is talking to Timothy. Timothy is the pastor, and he's giving him some instruction about some of these age-different relationships or gender-different relationships. And he's saying, now here's what you ought to do, Timothy. Here's where I want you. Now, he may have been reacting, may have been stating this, because in the previous chapter, Paul had said, now don't let anybody despise you or look down on you because of your youth. Well, Timothy may have gotten the idea, oh, so I'll rule the roost. I'll lay it down. Well, Paul wants to diffuse any kind of notions like that. And so he starts this out, and he's saying to him, now here's the way you ought to treat those that are older. Don't address an older man harshly, but appeal to him as if he were your father. So there is that awareness of age. And you're going to address that older man, Mr. Pastor. You're going to address that older man in the congregation with respect as though he was your father. You're going to appeal to him as a father. It doesn't mean he's right. It means he deserves respect because of age. All right? Then what's he say about younger men? Treat him as a brother. What does that mean? I know some brothers I don't think I'd want to model after. You can't say to all family, well, now treat him like you do your brother. Well, no, that might not be good advice. What does he mean? Treat them as brothers.
Love him as a brother.
Okay.
You can't pal around with your brother. You
So-
don't lord it over him, or you don't.
Okay.
Treat him as an equal.
Treat him as an equal. I think it's very important. Treat him as an equal. Treat him as a family member. You're brothers forever and ever. And so treat him as though he belongs. And so you're going to speak to him on this level, the same level you're on. And that's the way you can get people on board. Doing the right thing is treat them with respect as an equal. So again, what Paul does not want Timothy to do is to lord it over the people in that congregation. Don't do that. That's what he's getting at. Okay, what does he say? What's the next thing he says?
Older women as mothers.
All right, older women as mother. Now, what does that mean as you think about that? If a
Older women as if they were your mother. You
Okay.
respect your mother.
Yeah.
And you treat her, or you should treat her kindly. I'm sure that there's some that don't.
You should respect your mother.
You didn't
Yes.
talk back to your mom.
What'd you say?
You didn't talk back to your mom.
Yeah, when you were growing up, you probably didn't talk back to mom.
At least not more than once. Anyway.
Also, I think there's a tenderness that's between you and your mother. I know there is between me and my mother. There's a tenderness. There's a love that's there. And when I see needs that my mother has, now that she has Alzheimer's, and she's in a care facility, and my heart goes out to her, and I treat my mother with respect. There's been a role reversal. I'm her durable power of attorney. So there's a role reversal, but that role reversal has that deep respect and love that there has to be. That's godly. And you know what? My wife treats my mother like she was her mother. She does. And I really appreciate that. So there's that respect. And what would be the opposite to that? A pastor treating older women with disrespect. What does that look like?
Ugly.
Yeah, it's ugly. Putting her down, not letting her speak, not concerned about what she feels or what her needs are. That's an ugly situation. And then what's the next thing he says?
Younger women as sisters with all purity.
All right. And treat the younger women as though she was your sister. I've got a lot of sisters in this church. Teresa Brotherton was my secretary for, I don't know how many years, 50 years or maybe not quite that long. Yeah. And we had a lot of family similarities. In fact, we both thought, after she met my sisters Rosie and Nancy, she said, you know what? I fit right in with the family. I said, yeah, you do. You're just like another sister to me. And, Teresa and I respected each other as brother and sister. We had to work together, but we treated each other with utmost respect as brother and sister in Christ. And that's what Paul is talking about here, is that we ought to treat them as a sister. How many pastors have gotten into trouble with getting into an affair with some woman in the congregation?
Lots.
A lot of pastors have ruined their ministry, have ruined families within a church, and it's devastating what can happen with that. And so Paul is saying, you treat those young women as though they're a sister, and you make sure what that means is with all purity. And so that's the only spiritual way to do that. So, when people are in a position, when men are in a position of being a pastor, sometimes women look up to that man, and maybe they compare the pastor with their own husband who is not being nice to them. I remember when I was growing up, I had a pastor, Everett Hovey, and Pastor Hovey and Pastor Olin Baxter, who was pastor, those two men were friends. And they were building buildings at the same time. When they were building this, we were building a building in Oskaloosa, Iowa, at the same time. I remember one time, Pastor, he kind of took me under his wing because he knew I was heading for ministry, and so I spent some time with him. And he said, one time, one lady had said, Pastor, I'm in love with you. And he said, no, you're not. You're in love with the idea of who I am, but you don't really know me. And I thought he handled that very well. He said, you're putting me on a pedestal because I'm the pastor, and you only see the best part of me. That's the only part you'll ever see of me. That's the only part on display. But when I'm at home, I'm a different person. Well, not a whole lot different, but still, I thought that was pretty good. He handled that by just saying, I think you're really in love with the idea of who I am. And so don't nurse that, because that's not going to go anywhere. And he made it very clear that he was not available.
And you had no idea that you would pastor at this church someday.
No, absolutely no idea. And he and Pastor Olin were in constant communication. They were friends, and they were constantly talking back and forth and advising each other. And I had no idea that one day I would come in. Nor did I have any idea when I went to East Iowa Bible Camp and served as a dean there, and I pastored a church there, a community church of Deep River. I had no idea Alfred Spain had been the pastor there, and he's the one that started that camp that I went to as a little kid, and then I was the dean of that camp later on when I was pastoring. I had no idea. It wasn't until I came here and we were looking through a history book, I saw Alfred Spain's name. Alfred Spain?
You were meant to be here. I think you were meant to be here.
Yeah, I think so. And Christian circles is a small world. So anyway, he is talking about how to treat people. And then he spends an extended amount of time talking about the widows that were in the church. And so he wants to talk, and that's in verses 3 through 16. It's the largest section in the New Testament on how to treat widows that are within the church. And you have to realize that what he's given here is tied to the first century culture. There's a lot of difference between first century Roman Empire and 21st century United States of America. There's a whole lot of social differences between those two, and so keep that in mind as we go through these. But nevertheless, in the Roman Empire, and you're in the Roman Empire, you're at Ephesus. It's a Gentile area. You don't have as much of a Jewish background as some other places that Paul would have ministered, and so you've got a culture that's going on there, and they don't have welfare programs. They don't have WIC. The WIC, isn't that women? What does that stand for?
WIC is women who are either pregnant or they already had a child and they go get milk or stuff like that for the mother, or formula and stuff for
Right.
the baby. So
Yeah, so that's a program for pregnant mothers or those who've just had a baby, and so they can provide. Okay, Roman Empire doesn't have that. In fact, they didn't have any programs for widows. The Roman Empire had no. I looked it up, and they had no social provisions for widows. They had, towards the end of the empire, they had some welfare, but it was given out to the poor generally, and it was grain. They distributed grain, that's all. They had grain available. So if you were poor, you can go get a sack full of grain. I know that doesn't help you with your doctor bill. It doesn't help you with the rent. But what it does do is it puts a grain in your pouch, and that's it. Now you figure out what to do with that grain. Okay, that's a lot different. So because of that, Israel as a nation had been lots and lots of Old Testament instructions on what to do with widows. and taking care of them. And the church also had to have instruction on what to do with widows and how to take care of them. And so what are listed here are some guidelines. I don't look at these as hard and fast rules with no exceptions. I look at these as guidelines for first century taking care of widows. I've pastored long enough to know there are a lot of exceptions to hard and fast rules. And a lot of times we need guidelines to work with. So let's look at this section, starting in verse 3. Somebody read that for me, verse 3.
Honor widows who are widows indeed.
Okay, I think this is the thesis statement or the general principle that now governs the rest of the discussion. That one statement. Honor, and by honor, what he means is honor them with money, honor them with a place to live, honor them with food, whatever provisions. That's what that word honor here in this context means. It means take care of their needs. Who are widows indeed. And he's actually creating a category by saying that, widows indeed. Now then, he's going to list 3 types of widows. Now, a widow indeed is not just a widow, but a widow that has real need. So a widow indeed is a widow in need. It's probably the way we ought to say that. So let's start at verse 4 and see what unfolds here. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, they should first learn to fulfill their duty toward their own household, and so repay their parents what is owed them. Well, that's a great principle, isn't it? They had their turn taking care of you, now it's your turn to take care of them. That's basically the principle that's laid out here. And so, now, evidently, there was a large number of widows in the church at Ephesus. A large number. Because he has so many categories here, there has to be quite a few in there. So he's saying, widows indeed, but now that's category 1. Widows that have children and grandchildren that can take care of them, and so those widows ought not to be a burden on the meager church resources. That's the point. But the kids ought to kick in here and take care of them. What does it say? For this is what pleases God. What is it that pleases God?
Honor your father and mother.
When you honor your father and mother, when you take care of the needs of your aging parents, that honors God. Okay, let's go on. Verse 5. But the widow who is truly in need and completely on her own has set her hope on God and continues in her pleas and prayers night and day. Okay, that's category 2. This is a widow, doesn't have children or grandchildren take care of her. She is really a widow in need. And she dedicates her time to worshiping the Lord and serving the Lord. That's the only thing she can do. As you'll see in a moment, she is also at least 60 years old. You'll see that in just a verse or two. And in the first century, 60 years old, you were considered an old man or an old woman at 60. And you had one foot in the grave.
Which is not true.
Okay, well, our longevity is quite a bit longer now, but the first century, you know, so you'll see this reference is 60 in just a minute. So anyway, this widow, who does this remind you of? Somebody comes to my mind when I read this. Maybe it's because I've been writing the Christmas program and I included the story of this particular widow. Anna. She'd been married for 10 years or 11 years, I forget how many it was, to her husband, and now she's 84. So she's way past that 60, 84. And what she's done since she became a widow is she spent her time in the temple, praying and fasting. She's the prayer warrior. She's the woman you went up to. You went to the temple and you said, I'm going to get Anna to pray for this family situation. I'm going to get Anna to pray for this. She was your prayer warrior. And you knew that Anna would spend her time in fellowship with the Lord, and you knew she had dedicated her life to being your prayer warrior. Isn't that great? And so that's what she did all the rest of her life. And that's why God honored her by being able to see Jesus as an infant. So anyway, you can see that this is a widow indeed. That means she's in need. Now, that's not different from the Old Testament. In the Old Testament law, that widow would have been taken care of. But now that we're in the church age and there's a break between the law and the New Testament, Paul has to lay down these kind of guidelines. All right, so let's see what else is said. But the one, verse 6, but the one who lives for pleasure, this is category 3 of the widows, okay? The first category, she had children and grandchildren, they ought to be taken care of her. The second category, a widow indeed, and she is a spiritual woman. Now here's category 3. And what does verse 6 say? The one who lives for pleasure is dead even while she lives. And what does that mean? Okay, this woman is not spending her time in the temple praying.
She's doing what she wants to do.
Yeah, she's
Worldly.
yeah, she's worldly, and you know, maybe she's flirtatious, maybe she's just not living a Christian life. And it's interesting, Paul says, the church is not to financially take care of her. I think that's interesting. Does it mean she doesn't have needs? No, she has needs. But the church was not to put her on the list of people that we take care of. Because what's she using that money for?
Right.
And she's probably having more and more children, more than likely.
All right. And again, I would say these are general guidelines. And there could be a woman who has lived promiscuously for some years as a widow. Now she's got her life turned around. And you look at her situation different than the woman who's still caught up in it. So again, we've had guidelines. What else? What comes after that? After verse 6? Reinforce these commands so that they will be beyond reproach. Somebody read verse 8.
If anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for his immediate family, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever.
Okay. What does that verse mean?
person an unbeliever. In other words, you should be, if you're young, and you should be taking care of your parents. If you are a little older, fit in this category of widows, you should be praying, not seeking party time, so on.
Okay, so here is a situation, and let's just say we have a man, a son. It could have been a daughter, but a son. He has the wherewithal to take care of his mother, maybe his aging parent, maybe both of them, but he's not doing it. And Paul says that guy is worse than an infidel. He's worse than an unbeliever. He's worse than an unsaved Gentile, because you've got unsaved Gentiles taking care of their parents. Doesn't mean he isn't saved. It means his behavior is worse than an unsaved person. Well, I don't want to have a character that when compared to the unsaved, I come up short. That's not good, right? But that's what Paul is saying here. And so what he is saying is that God really expects us to take care of family. He really expects that. All right, verse 9. We get some more regulations about Category 2. Category 2 were women who didn't have anybody to support them. But look at the further qualifications here. No widow should be put on the list unless she is what?
Over 60.
Okay, she's got to be 60 years old, at least 60 years old. And then what else?
Faithful to her husband.
I got stereo on that.
Verse 10 says she must be well respected by everyone because of the good she has done. She has brought up her children well, or has she brought up her children well? Has she been kind to strangers and served other believers humbly? Has she helped those who are in trouble? Has she always been ready to do good?
Okay. I want you to notice that there are some very similar qualifications for this widow, because you have to realize what it means to be put on the list here. The list it means that the church is really picking up the tab for most of this woman's expenses. The church is picking up the tab. So in other words, you have a lot, she is not employed by the church, but she is supported by that church. Remember, that's first century, where they didn't have any other way to do that, those widows. This was their, they couldn't go collect Social Security. That was not available. So if you didn't have family or friends or a church take care of your needs, you were up a creek without a paddle. All right, so, but notice the qualifications for this woman who is on the list is very similar to the qualifications for a deacon or for an elder. Now, let's go back to one. She must be the wife of one husband. Literally in Greek she has to be a one-man woman. Well, what does that mean? Well, it is the same construction that is used as a qualification of an elder or a deacon, a one-woman man. Now that does not mean one per life. For if it meant that, then here's this godly woman and her godly husband dies and she remarries. Now she's on man number 2. And if he dies, make sure it wasn't homicide. No. If do we have a pattern going here? But the idea here is that you have a woman who is not promiscuous. It's the same way with the men. And now, there are different interpretations that theologians have given through the ages, and one of them was Dr. Charles Ryrie, and he took that to mean one per life, which would mean that a man whose wife died and he remarried is disqualified from position of leadership in the church. And I don't subscribe to Ryrie's view on that, because all of the other qualifications for an elder or deacon have to do with the present behavioral patterns Oh. Looks like I must be about done.
Oh, you have to go back and do it all over.
Oh, it just got plugged in? Oh, well. So anyway, what he is saying here is that there has to be this quality, these observable qualities in the person. She has a reputation in the church for being of high quality. And so I think what we'll do is we'll end it right there. There are some other instructions in your notes. You'll see there are instructions for pastors and other church after the leaders, how to respect church leaders. And then he ends this chapter with ordaining new men, and then some personal matters. And all of that has to do with just very good principles for how that we ought to treat each other. Okay, well, I think we'll quit right there. It's about 1:15. And so let's have a word of prayer. Should we do that? Randy, why don't you lead us in prayer?
Heavenly Father, thank